Johnny Carson sobbed on national TV during Bette Midler's performance, but the true, heartbreaking reason was only revealed to her backstage moments later. His private 12-word confession unveiled the monumental price he paid for fame and the life he chose to leave behind. The crew moved with a solemnity that bordered on ritual, their normal hurried movements slowed by the immense weight of the moment, each one knowing they were serving their last communion with the king. Yet, among the quiet tears and the forced jokes, there was one star who understood the moment in a way nobody else did. A fiercely devoted friend who was preparing to step onto that stage and deliver the final, most emotional gift, Bette Midler. She was Johnny Carson's true emotional counterpoint, the only guest who could consistently crack his shell of famous, impenetrable detachment. They had a bond forged not in public appearances but in private admiration, a relationship that transcended show business and brushed against genuine connection. Bette had been there for his 20th anniversary, she'd been there for his biggest triumphs, and now she was there to close the book. The production team had prepared her final sequence meticulously, expecting the standard Midler magic, a blend of humor and spectacular heart. They expected tears, yes, but those would be the tears of a grateful audience, a professional farewell. What they, and certainly what Bette Midler, failed to comprehend was that for Johnny, this final night was not just about saying goodbye to a show. It was about confronting the shadows of a life perfectly lived in public but perhaps imperfectly lived in private. He was known for his impenetrable coolness, the man who let nothing show, who could deflect the deepest pain with a perfectly timed joke. But deep down, he was a man haunted by the sacrifices he had made at the altar of ambition. Every one of his famous, polished smiles had cost him something real, something he'd left behind on the open prairie of Nebraska decades earlier. Now, as the clock ticked toward the final segment, Johnny sat at his desk, his famous blue eyes scanning the notes, perhaps seeing not the lines of a monologue but the faded, sepia-toned image of a girl he had once loved with the simple certainty of a country boy. The crowd's applause was a distant roar, a distraction from the quiet voice of regret he was finally forced to hear. He was meticulously composed, ready to deliver a flawless final performance, yet he carried an invisible emotional burden that only the perfect key could unlock. He knew Bette was about to sing, and that alone was enough to threaten his famous resolve. He just didn't know what she was about to sing. This was the quiet, intimate truth behind the desk. Johnny Carson was never afraid of failure, he was afraid of memory. And tonight, on the biggest night of his career, memory was finally coming for him. The curtain was about to rise on a performance neither star had prepared for. Bette Midler thought she was giving him a gift of music. She had no idea she was about to become the unknowing architect of his most profound public unraveling. When the show finally returned from the final commercial break, Bette Midler stood waiting, ready to deliver her emotional coup de grace. But as she leaned toward the microphone and quietly whispered the name of the song she had chosen, an audible ripple of surprise went through the band. That simple title, unheard by the audience, instantly erased the 29 years of Carson's legendary career, leaving him defenseless against a past he thought he had buried forever. The applause for Bette Midler finally subsided, leaving behind a charged silence unique to a momentous occasion. She stood center stage not in one of her glittering gowns, but in a simple, elegant dark dress, signaling sincerity over spectacle. She was slated for a guaranteed hit, but as she stepped to the microphone, she glanced briefly at Johnny. "So, I'm going to sing a song tonight that I think you haven't heard in a very long time," she announced, her voice softening. "A song I learned from an old friend of yours." A murmur went through the orchestra pit. Doc Severinsen and the band exchanged looks of confusion. This was not the prearranged chart. The first notes were played softly on a grand piano, a hesitant, poignant ballad from the 1950s. The song was "The Glory of Love," and Bette's rendition was raw and infused with an aching sincerity. As her voice, rich, pure, and utterly devoted, filled the studio, every eye in the room pivoted back to the host at his desk. Johnny Carson was caught completely off guard. He had been preparing a professional reaction, but as the familiar melody landed, his composure instantly failed. His face, normally a masterpiece of controlled performance, went instantly blank. The slight, polite smile he wore vanished. his eyes glazed over, losing focus on Bette, and seeming to look through 4 decades of success, right back to a dusty, one-room apartment in Omaha, Nebraska. The very first line of the song was like a needle piercing the thin, protective skin of his celebrity, releasing a suppressed gasp that only Ed McMahon, sitting inches away, could register. The audience missed the change, but the camera operators knew. They saw the sudden, rigid posture, the way his knuckles tightened around the edge of his mahogany desk. They realized this gentle, unassuming ballad was not just music. It was a key turning in a lock he never wanted opened. For the next few minutes, the king of late night was not Johnny Carson, the witty host. He was just a man, imprisoned by a few simple, calamitous musical notes. Bette's voice continued to rise, weaving a spell of heartbreaking beauty across the millions watching. But at the desk, Johnny's battle had just begun. The melody was reaching into his soul, pulling a specific memory forward, the sight of a long-lost face and a youthful promise that the pursuit of fame had ruthlessly broken. The lens of the main camera, known affectionately as Big Bertha to the crew, was trained on Johnny, providing a brutal visual intimacy reserved only for the millions at home. In that tight shot, the famous Carson mask was melting, dissolving under the weight of an unsought memory. The raw, unfiltered sorrow that crossed his face was the look of a man suddenly hearing the name of a girl he left behind decades ago. Clara. Bette's voice, now entering the second verse, spoke of constancy and enduring belief, the very ideals that Johnny had been forced to abandon. His eyes, usually dancing with professional energy, were fixed on a point just over Bette's head, unseeing. This was the crack in the king's mask, the sudden, terrifying realization that the walls he had spent a lifetime building had been effortlessly breached by 3 minutes of music. Ed McMahon, the loyal sideman, leaned forward. Ed had seen every version of Johnny, but this was a naked, vulnerable Johnny, and it was deeply unsettling. The microphone was hot, and the moment was holy. Ed simply waited, mirroring the quiet confusion of a best friend who realizes a profound secret has been kept from him for years. As Bette sang the line about enduring hardship for love, the scene in Johnny's mind materialized instantly. He wasn't in Studio One. He was standing on a frigid night in Omaha, Nebraska, circa 1951, beneath the sputtering neon sign of The Starlight. The memory of Clara's face and that same song drifting from the jukebox consumed him entirely. It was the night he had told her goodbye, the moment he traded a simple, shared life for a life of unparalleled, isolated fame. The flash was instantaneous, yet when he blinked, the studio lights were back. But the residual emotion, the deep ache of regret, remained. He reached a hand up to touch his face, as if to make sure the face he wore was still the king of late night and not the heartbroken, ambitious boy. The audience, finally noticing the unnatural stillness at the desk, began to murmur softly. Bette, lost in the song's rich emotion, continued to sing, unaware that her innocent performance had become the instrument of her friend's deepest, most hidden pain. The tension was now palpable, the air charged with the anticipation of a secret about to break the surface. If that memory flash was the key, the full story behind it was the lock. The man who had defined American cool for 3 decades was now trembling, a ghost of a simple life he had forfeited dancing behind his eyes. He had to keep the story of Clara buried, but the melody was too insistent, and the walls of his emotional fortress were crumbling fast. If this secret glimpse behind the curtain touched your heart, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss the shocking truth Bette is about to unveil. The music swells, and we leave the soundstage completely, pulled back through the tunnel of time to the simple, unforgiving expanse of the Nebraska plains in 1951, where a younger, hungrier version of Johnny Carson first discovered the devastating conflict between ambition and true affection. This is where he found Clara, and where he ultimately broke her heart and his own. Clara was not glamorous, she was grace defined by quiet strength, a young woman who worked at the local telephone exchange and dreamed of a simple life shared with a funny, talented man who played a mean trumpet. She was the anchor. They spent their evenings beneath the immense, star-dusted Nebraska sky, and always their music was playing, that one special, poignant ballad. The glory of love, was the blueprint for their future, a vow they held in every shared glance. Clara believed in Johnny, but her mother had a chronic ailment requiring constant care. Clara's sense of duty was as powerful as Johnny's ambition. She couldn't follow him to Hollywood. She looked at fame and saw risk. Johnny looked at Omaha and saw a cage. The night he left, they stood beneath the sputtering neon sign of the Starlight Diner, the soft melody of their song drifting out. "Go, Johnny," she had whispered, her eyes brimming. "But remember, that song is the map back home. If you ever decide home is where your heart truly belongs." He promised he would return. But fame is a demanding mistress, and the phone calls grew shorter, the letters less frequent. The silence of the Great Plains swallowed the promise whole. Johnny became the king, but he had lost his queen. He became the star who delivered monologues, leaving the young man who promised love behind. The cost of the crown was a life unlived. He locked the memory away, sealing it with the cold iron of ambition. And now, on his final night, Bette Midler, the divine Miss M, was unknowingly performing the key to his greatest regret, singing the story of the one woman who knew the real Johnny Carson before he became Carson. The music was reaching its emotional apex, and as Bette sang the word Omaha, a dam broke inside him. The music was an ocean, and Johnny Carson was engulfed in the flood of a lifetime's worth of unacknowledged regret, while Bette Midler's beautiful voice sailed on, unaware she was navigating the treacherous waters of his hidden heartbreak. If you have a story about a choice you had to make between love and ambition, share it in the comments below. We want to hear your deepest truth. The final soaring notes of the ballad hung in the air, a velvet curtain of sound closing over the 40-year tragedy of Clara and the life unlived. Bette Midler held the last note with impeccable, heartbreaking clarity, and it was the sound of that final, pure tone, the summation of all the love and loss contained in that old song, that finally shattered Johnny Carson's legendary control. On the home screens of 20 million Americans, something remarkable and profoundly personal unfolded. The camera, still holding that intimate close-up, caught the precise moment the wall came down. It wasn't a sob or a gasp. It was the silent, almost reverent appearance of a single, unstoppable tear. It escaped the corner of his eye, traveling a slow, deliberate path down the famous, familiar curve of his cheek. A clear, shimmering rivulet of pure, distilled regret. Ed McMahon, who had been sitting with his hands folded, watching the emotional scene play out, instantly recognized the tremor passing through his friend. Ed knew this wasn't television. This was reality bleeding onto the stage. He averted his gaze, focusing intensely on his notes, giving Johnny the ultimate gift of privacy in the most public of moments. He kept his own composure, shielding Johnny simply by refusing to acknowledge the tear, allowing the host a tiny pocket of dignity in the midst of his visible turmoil. The audience, already primed for emotion, felt the shift immediately. They saw the tear, now glinting under the harsh studio lights, and a profound hush fell over the room. This was not the polite, appreciative silence of a sophisticated crowd. This was the charged stillness of people witnessing something sacred, something they were not meant to see. For those few seconds, Johnny Carson was not the polished celebrity. He was just a vulnerable man whose heart had been unexpectedly laid bare. Bette, still holding the powerful, final posture of her song, saw the moisture in his eyes from her perch on stage. But her artistic mind misinterpreted the signal. She thought she had moved him to tears simply by the beauty of her performance, a testament to her talent and their friendship. There was a brief flicker of pride, followed quickly by the concern that she had broken the sophisticated tone of the farewell. She finished the song with a tender smile, unaware that her innocent rendition had just resurrected the central ghost of his adult life. As the last musical chord decayed into silence, the audience erupted. But the ovation felt different. It was a standing salute to vulnerability, not just to music. Johnny, using the noise as a shield, quickly wiped his cheek, a flicker of irritation at his own lack of control crossing his face before he managed to pull the Carson mask back into place. But the damage was done. The ice had cracked. He knew he had to speak to bridge the devastating gap between the raw emotion and the professional requirement of his job. But the sight of Clara's life sacrificed for the sake of the applause that now surrounded him had left his throat tight. He attempted to smile, a brittle, shaky effort, but his voice was gone, caught somewhere between the stage and that distant Nebraska memory. The standing ovation thundered around Bette Midler, who curtsied deeply, thrilled, but completely bewildered by the intensity of the reaction she'd caused. She had brought Johnny Carson to his knees, metaphorically, but she had no idea why. As the lights dimmed for the final commercial break, she rushed off stage, intent on finding him, needing to know if she had delivered a triumphant moment or committed a heartbreaking mistake. The standing ovation for Bette Midler was massive, yet her joy was undercut by a sharp professional confusion. She had seen the raw emotion that cracked the legendary Carson cool, and she couldn't reconcile it with her own artistic intentions. Had she chosen a tune connected to a painful, hidden memory? Bette felt suddenly lost, realizing she might have delivered a blow instead of a benediction. She rushed off stage, brushing past the congratulating producers. "Find him," she whispered urgently to her assistant. "I need to know what that was. I need to know now." Meanwhile, Johnny was already executing his legendary post-emotional protocol, the professional retreat. He forced a smile, gave Bette a thumbs up, and then, as the studio floor swelled with noise, he pushed himself away from the desk. He moved with the detached efficiency of a man running from his own reflection toward the safety of his dressing room, the one place the cameras never followed. Bette Midler moved through the chaotic backstage corridor with the determination of a heat-seeking missile. She knew this was her last chance. Once the final segment started, Johnny would retreat fully behind the wall. Her mind raced, finding no explanation for his collapse. She realized the reason must be tied to something ancient and personal. She found his door slightly ajar. Through the opening, she could see him sitting at his makeup mirror, staring at his reflection. The smile was gone, replaced by an expression of deep, internal exhaustion. He was simply looking at the 40-year-old regret etched around his eyes. Bette pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. The silence in that small, private room was heavier than the silence on stage. She had delivered the most powerful performance of the night, yet she was terrified. He was the king, yet he looked utterly fragile. He turned slowly in his chair, acknowledging her. He didn't need to explain the tear to the world, but he needed to explain it to her, the only living soul who had been the accidental key to his longest-kept secret. Bette stood poised, ready to demand the truth behind the tear, but Johnny merely gestured to a small chair in the corner. "Close the door, Bette," he said, his voice quiet and rough. "There's something I need to tell you, something that happened a long, long time ago in a place that has nothing to do with this stage. Share this powerful story with someone who needs a reminder that even legends carry secrets in their heart." Bette Midler sat on the small chair, her elaborate stage wear suddenly feeling absurdly out of place in the dark, intimate room. She watched Johnny, the man she revered, the king of late night, shrink before her eyes, becoming just a tired, vulnerable man facing an unwelcome memory. The makeup mirror reflected not a star, but a figure of immense, private regret. "I'm sorry, Johnny," Bette finally whispered, the apology stripped of all her usual brassiness. "I didn't know the song would do that. I picked it because it felt sentimental. I thought you would love it." Johnny smiled faintly, a genuine, private expression that never made it to the stage. "I did love it, Bette," he said, his voice husky. "That's the problem." He motioned toward the song's meaning. That song was ours, mine and Clara's. And then, in the quiet solitude of his final hours as host, Johnny Carson, the most famously guarded man in show business, gave Bette Midler the gift of his truth. He told her about Clara in Omaha, the girl who loved the promise of a small life, the girl he left behind for the colossal uncertainty of fame. He spoke of the neon sign, the shared vow, and the crippling silence that followed as his career ascended. It was a rapid, condensed history of his greatest emotional failure, a confession delivered without self-pity, only profound sorrow. He paused, looking down at his hands, the famous hands that had shuffled cards and held microphones, but had never truly held on to Clara. The silence hung heavy, letting Bette's confusion reach its absolute peak before he delivered the words that had haunted him for decades. He finally looked at her, and the words that summarized a lifetime of regret were delivered, quiet and devastating. "That song, it was the life I chose not to live, Bette. Bette was stunned into complete stillness. She realized the tear wasn't for his retirement or for their friendship. It was for a ghost. Her shock quickly transformed into a deep, protective empathy. She looked at him, this icon, this legend, and saw only the Nebraska boy who made the wrong choice out of blinding ambition. He hadn't shared this pain with any of his wives, nor with his closest friends, but he had shared it with her, the woman who had unknowingly served as the messenger from his past. "Johnny," she breathed, the sheer loneliness of his confession settling over her. "I had no idea." She reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "No idea how much you carried beneath the surface." The glamour and the comedy and the genius suddenly seemed like thin barriers protecting a vast, aching emptiness. He simply nodded, the relief of finally sharing the burden warring with the renewed pain of the memory. The stage lights outside the door felt miles away, and for the first time in 3 decades, Johnny Carson felt truly exposed, yet oddly liberated, as if a fever had finally broken. The true reason for his emotional breakdown had been delivered, a private truth that should have ended the exchange. But as Bette stared into Johnny's eyes, trying to absorb the magnitude of his secret, she felt a profound, chilling flicker of recognition. She hadn't just accidentally chosen a song, she suddenly realized she knew the messenger. She had seen Clara's name before, and the shocking implication of that single, forgotten fan letter instantly made the whole story terrifyingly real. The air in the dressing room, already heavy with Johnny's confession, seemed to drop a few degrees as Bette Midler inhaled sharply, her gaze fixed, not on Johnny, but on the middle distance of a forgotten memory. The revelation of Clara's story was one thing. The realization that Bette was connected to that story was the final, profound shock that turned fate into destiny. "Johnny," Bette began, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to her powerful singing voice. "The song, 'The Glory of Love,' you said you didn't know why I chose it. You thought it was sentimental." She shook her head slowly, a sudden, thrilling terror in her eyes. "It wasn't random. I didn't choose it." Johnny stared at her, the exhaustion draining from his face, replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity. "What are you talking about, Bette? Doc said you gave them a last-minute change." "I did," she confirmed, "but the request didn't come from me. It came from a letter, years ago, maybe 10 years ago, an unusual fan letter, not addressed to me, but to the production staff. It was so specific, so heartfelt, that my manager kept it in a file labeled "Must Do Sentimental." It asked me if I ever performed on your final show to sing that song. The dressing room was silent, save for the muffled sound of the crew dismantling the stage outside. Johnny listened, the blood seeming to slow in his veins. The timing of the letter, the specific condition tied to his farewell, it was too much for coincidence. "The person who sent it," Bette continued, leaning closer, her voice dropping lower, "the person said they loved the song because it reminded them of the life they knew you deserved before Hollywood took you. They signed it. Clara from Omaha." The effect of the words was instantaneous and devastating. Johnny did not move, did not speak, but the simple mention of that name, that place, after he had just shared his soul's deepest secret, landed with the force of an actual blow. His eyes, already tear-filled from his own memories, brimmed again, this time not with regret, but with the shattering wonder of realization. Clara hadn't just accepted his choice, she had planned his final exit from the stage, years in advance. She hadn't been bitter, she had been patiently, quietly waiting for the right moment to send him a final, loving message across the decades. She used Bette Midler, the divine Miss M, as the unwitting carrier pigeon for her last, tender farewell. The fate of the king of late night, the man of immaculate control, had been dictated by a humble woman in Nebraska who understood the power of a simple, haunting melody. Bette, watching his face contort with this final, beautiful realization, reached out and took his hand, her own famous cool dissolving into simple compassion. "She never stopped loving the boy who played the trumpet, Johnny," Bette said softly, channeling Clara's voice across the miles and the years. "She wanted you to know that on your last night you weren't alone with your choice. You were loved." The song was not a reminder of a broken promise, but a final, powerful absolution. The revelation that Bette was the unknowing messenger of Clara's final grace connected the two stars in a moment of profound, shared destiny. Johnny's legendary reserve completely dissolved, and as he gripped Betty's hand, the king of late night knew, with a certainty that reached into his bones, that he had finally received the closure he had silently yearned for across 4 decades. The moment of silence stretched, profound and cleansing, an intimate eternity shared between two of the world's most celebrated performers, who were, in that small room, nothing more than two people linked by a ghost and a melody. Clara's message, delivered through Bette Midler's voice 40 years too late, had provided the absolution that Johnny Carson had never dared to seek. Johnny finally broke the silence, his voice a low, rough rumble. He reached a shaky hand to the small cabinet beside his mirror, retrieving 2 crystal glasses and a bottle of fine scotch he had reserved for his final, private moments off-air. He poured 2 measures, handing one to Bette. "To Clara," he simply stated, raising his glass, "the only person who ever truly made the Tonight Show schedule." Bette raised her glass, the tears welling in her own eyes now, tears of profound, empathetic relief. "To Clara," she echoed, "the greatest producer this show never had." They drank, and the warmth of the scotch mingled with the warmth of the emotional release, washing away decades of suppressed sorrow. Johnny leaned back, the tension that had held his shoulders rigid for the entire broadcast finally easing. He looked at Bette, the gratitude in his eyes immense and undisguised. "You have no idea, Bette. You thought you were singing for me, the host. You were singing for the boy I left in Omaha." And she found a way to say goodbye without ever asking for anything. This, Bette realized, was the final, defining act of Carson's private life. He had spent a lifetime creating perfect television, but this private, unscripted moment, the story of the tear, the forgotten love, the anonymous letter, was the most perfect thing he had ever participated in. "We keep this, Johnny," Bette declared, placing her glass down firmly. "This is ours. The world can have the breakdown, the tears, the farewell. But the real reason, the reason Clara sent me, that stays here. It's a promise." Johnny nodded, his eyes shining. He understood the sanctity of the secret. Bette Midler, the divine Miss M, had become the keeper of the king's most profound vulnerability, the last person to see the private man behind the polished exterior. They sat for a few more minutes, sharing quiet conversation not about the next guest or the ratings, but about the simple elegance of Clara's final gesture and the strange, poetic justice of her orchestrating his farewell. As the crew chief knocked on the door, signaling the final minutes before the last segment, Johnny stood up, the old professional composure slowly returning, but this time it was softer, gentler. The man who walked out of that room was still Johnny Carson, but he was a man who had made peace with his past. He straightened his jacket, giving Bette one last, private, meaningful look that conveyed volumes of shared history and profound gratitude. The king of late night was returning to his throne, ready to face the final curtain, a man now unburdened by the ghost of a choice he had finally truly mourned. When Johnny Carson returned to the stage for his final segment, the cameras didn't catch the difference, but the man himself knew. He stood before the cheering crowd, no longer just a television icon closing a chapter, but a man who had received absolution from the one person whose forgiveness he had silently needed for 40 years. The tear, captured forever on tape, became the symbol of his vulnerability, yet the public never understood the depth of the emotion. They saw sadness over saying goodbye to his job. They never knew it was sorrow for the life he had said goodbye to for his job. He finished the show with impeccable grace, delivering his famous final words with a dignity that was suddenly, deeply earned. The applause faded, the lights came up, and Johnny Carson walked off that stage and into history, carrying a secret that would bind him eternally to Bette Midler. Bette kept her promise. Though countless reporters asked her about the famous breakdown in the years that followed, she always gave the same answer, delivered with a hint of profound respect. It was just a man saying goodbye to a life he loved. She deflected, joked, and changed the subject, allowing the public to have their sentimental interpretation while she guarded the truth of Clara, the little girl from Nebraska who became the most important ghost in Johnny's career. The bond between Johnny and Bette changed forever that night. It wasn't just friendship, it was shared destiny. She was the one he trusted, the one he knew had seen the real cost of the crown. In his quiet retirement years, whenever they spoke, they would share a knowing glance or a quiet word about the glory of love, a phrase that became their private shorthand for sacrifice, regret, and enduring affection. What truly defined the legacy of that moment wasn't the tear itself, but the act of closure it represented. Johnny Carson lived the rest of his years not as the driven, guarded man constantly running from his past, but as a man who had finally made peace with his greatest failure of the heart. He found a new, quieter joy, unburdened by the weight of the Omaha years. He had finally acknowledged the life he couldn't choose, and in doing so, he fully embraced the life he did. Bette once visited him years later and saw him sitting alone, not with awards, but with a piece of paper, a crumpled, yellowed napkin he had stolen that night from the Starlight Diner, the only physical token of Clara he allowed himself to keep. This is the true, untold story of Johnny Carson's farewell. It reminds us that fame and success are merely footnotes when compared to the simple, profound ache of the human heart. The king of late night achieved everything the world could offer, yet his tears were shed for a love he lost, not for a kingdom he left. And Bette Midler, the divine Miss M, proved that sometimes the greatest artistic achievement is not a spectacular song, but simply being the right messenger at the right, devastating time. The tear on his final night was not the ending of a television show. It was the quiet, necessary eulogy for a dream that had perished in Nebraska years ago. Johnny Carson walked away from the screen that night, not with regret, but with the quiet dignity of a man who finally received a final, loving blessing from his past. If this incredible story of Johnny Carson and Bette Midler touched your heart and reminded you that even the biggest stars carry hidden regrets, please hit the like button to show your support. And to ensure you never miss another untold tale from the human side of history, subscribe right now and join our community of sentimental story lovers.